Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I grew up in a small town just outside of San Antonio, Texas. I always knew getting my driver's license would be crucial for my independence. My parents both worked long hours at their jobs, and public transportation was practically non-existent in our area. That's why as soon as I turned 15, I convinced them to enroll me in a driver's education course to get my learner's permit. I was excited about the whole thing, especially since I'd spent countless hours playing racing games and watching my parents drive. How different could it be, right? Well, let me tell you about this driving instructor I had to deal with. The course involved several sessions where you drive around with the instructor and two other students, taking turns between driving and observing. I got lucky, or so I thought, being first up on this particular Saturday morning. The instructor was this middle-aged guy who always wore these thick-rimmed glasses and had this habit of tapping his pen against the clipboard whenever he was annoyed, which seemed to be most of the time. As I was pulling out of the school parking lot, feeling pretty confident about my driving skills, a dozen small sparrows suddenly flew right in front of my windshield. Naturally, I lightly tapped the brakes. It was just instinct, you know. The instructor immediately ordered me to pull over. I knew I was coming. He always made you pull over before he reprimanded you. It was like his signature move. When we stopped, he sternly told me that we don't stop for birds. I tried to explain that I had just lightly tapped the brakes because they were inches from the windshield, and it wasn't even a panic stop. But he just repeated his rule more firmly, stating that we do not stop for birds, making it clear that was final. About half an hour later, we were way outside town cruising in this tiny Geo Metro that struggled to maintain the 70 miles per hour speed limit I had set on cruise control. The car's three-cylinder engine was whining like it was about to give up on life, but I kept going. Then we came over the top of a hill, and there they were, half a dozen wild turkeys, taking their sweet time crossing the road ahead. Now remembering my instructor's very specific orders about not stopping for birds, I maintained my course. The turkeys were getting closer and closer, and I showed absolutely no sign of slowing down. Suddenly, the instructor slammed his brake pedal on his side of the car and yelled for me to pull over immediately. Once I pulled over, he made me get completely out of the car. His face was red, and that vein in his forehead was popping out. He angrily demanded to know what I was thinking and why I hadn't slowed down for the turkeys. I looked him straight in the eye, keeping my face completely neutral, and reminded him that he had told me not to stop for birds. His face went through about 5 different shades of red as he sputtered that I knew what he meant. He then ordered me to switch places with one of the other students, a girl who had been sitting in the back. That was the end of my driving for the day, but I still passed the course and got my permit. The instructor barely looked at me during the remaining sessions. But here's where it gets interesting. Remember that girl who replaced me? Well, she turned out to be the worst driver I've ever encountered, and I've seen some bad ones. The instructor passed her despite her obvious lack of skills, probably just to spite me. A year later, she was pulling into the local Sonic drive-in when she mixed up the gas and brake pedals. She plowed straight through several picnic tables, sending a family of 4 to the hospital. The incident made the local news. And guess who was interviewed about the quality of driver's education in our area? Our dear instructor. During the interview, when the local reporter asked if he stood by his decision to pass the student, he confidently claimed that they maintained the highest standards of training. The story gained traction on social media, and someone dug up records showing a pattern of questionable certifications from his driving school. The Department of Public Safety launched an investigation, and eventually, his instructor's license was suspended. The last I heard, he was working at a car wash, probably still telling people not to stop for birds. The family who was injured at Sonic made a full recovery and successfully sued both the girl and the driving school. They used the money to start a campaign for stricter driving instructor certifications in Texas. I went on to become a defensive driving instructor myself, and yes, I do teach my students to brake for birds, all kinds of birds. I was already running late for an important client meeting that morning. My boss had specifically asked me to handle this presentation, as it could mean a huge contract for our construction company. I'd spent weeks preparing for it, and now traffic on Burke Road in Melbourne's east was moving at a snail's pace. I work as a project manager, and after 15 years in construction, I've learned that punctuality is everything in this business. That's why I always leave early and have a dash cam installed. You never know what might happen on Melbourne roads. The traffic finally started moving and I maintained a steady pace, knowing there was still a chance I could make it on time. That's when I noticed a red BMW hatchback in my rearview mirror weaving through traffic like it was a Formula One race. I kept to my lane, focusing on the road ahead, when suddenly the BMW tried to overtake me where there clearly wasn't enough space. Before I could react, I felt the impact as their car clipped my front end. I called out to her to pull over to the side street, suggesting we could exchange details there. Instead of responding, this woman in fancy clothes and sunglasses stepped out of her BMW, phone in hand, and started taking photos like she was at a photo shoot. I repeated my request for her to move around the corner to exchange details. She responded with wild hand gestures, insisting she needed evidence because I had damaged her car. I tried to reassure her by mentioning I had dashcam footage she could have, but she completely ignored me. She continued walking around to get more angles of her precious BMW while a line of cars grew behind us. I raised my voice, telling her to move around the corner and stop blocking everyone's way. She responded by asking if I knew how much her car cost and questioning if I understood what I'd done. I pointed out that I had a dash cam that clearly showed her trying to overtake illegally. She stubbornly declared she knew her rights and refused to move until she had documented everything. At this point, I pulled out my phone and started recording her behavior too. Her attitude suddenly changed when she realized she was being filmed. She didn't seem to like being on the other end of the camera. I told her that the police would be interested in seeing both videos, her illegal overtaking attempt and her roadblock performance. She accused me of threatening her, but I corrected her, explaining that I was simply promising evidence. I then mentioned the specific fine for illegally overtaking in Victoria, up to $385 and 2 demerit points, and offered to call the police right then. Her face turned as red as her BMW. She finally got back in her car, and we pulled over to the side street. While exchanging information, I noticed her hands shaking as she tried to write down her details. Before leaving, I made sure to inform her that the dashcam footage would be forwarded to my insurance company and the police. I ended up missing my meeting, but it was worth it. My boss was understanding when I showed him the footage, and we rescheduled the client presentation. 2 weeks later, I received notice that the police had issued her a fine for dangerous overtaking, and my car ended up with just a small scratch. But her BMW? Well, let's just say that her insurance company wasn't too happy about paying for repairs to both vehicles after viewing my dashcam footage. I heard that her premium went up significantly. Expensive cars come with expensive consequences. This happened when I was in 6th grade during what was probably the hardest time of my life. My mom had been battling bone marrow cancer for 2 years. She was the strongest person I knew, working as a nurse while going through chemotherapy, still making it to my school events whenever she could, and somehow managing to keep our family together through it all. But towards the end of that school year, things took a turn for the worse. I remember sitting in the hospital with my dad, watching as she got weaker each day. The doctors had warned us, but nothing really prepares you for losing a parent. She passed away on a Wednesday evening with all of us by her side. The following week, I was back at school. Looking back, it was probably too soon, but my dad thought keeping a routine might help. Plus, we were nearing the end of elementary school and there were important placement tests coming up that would determine our classes for middle school. My English teacher was notorious throughout the school. Everyone called her the dragon lady behind her back because she would breathe fire at students for the smallest things. She'd yell at kids for sharpening their pencils too loudly or taking too long to find the right page in their textbook. But what happened that day went beyond her usual behavior. We were taking this placement test, and I couldn't focus at all. The words on the paper kept blurring together, and all I could think about was how my mom would never help me with my homework again. I tried my best, but I knew I had done poorly. After collecting the tests, the teacher announced she would call up everyone who scored below 75 to discuss their disappointing performance in front of the class. One by one, students went up, got berated, and returned to their seats looking defeated. When it was my turn, the teacher barked out my name and ordered me to come to her desk immediately. I slowly walked up, already feeling the tears building up. She held up my test paper, practically shoving it in my face as she pointed out my score of 58. She started berating me, saying it was absolutely unacceptable, and demanded to know if I had been paying attention in class at all. She accused me of being completely distracted all day, saying I had been staring into space like I was on vacation. I couldn't hold it back anymore and started crying. This only made her angrier. She told me to stop with the waterworks, and then she said something I'll never forget. She sneered that if I had cared as much about this test as whatever had been distracting me all day, then maybe I would have passed. That's when my best friend spoke up from her desk. She told the teacher, in front of everyone, that my mom had died just last week. The classroom went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. The teacher's face went from red to ghost white in seconds. I walked back to my desk, trying to wipe away my tears, while everyone stared. Later that day, I was called to the counselor's office. The counselor was incredibly kind and asked me to tell her exactly what happened. I told her everything, not just about that day, but about all the times the teacher had been unnecessarily cruel to students. The next day, I learned that several other students had gone to the counselor too, sharing their own experiences. It turned out my situation had opened the floodgates. The teacher was called into the principal's office, and when she returned, she looked like she'd been crying. For the rest of the year, she was unusually quiet and polite to everyone, especially me. But the biggest surprise came on the last day of school. The principal announced that our teacher would be pursuing other opportunities the following year. Apparently, her behavior had been reported multiple times before, but my incident was the final straw. I later found out from another teacher that she was given a choice: resign or face a formal review of her teaching methods. She chose to resign. While part of me felt bad, a bigger part felt relieved, knowing that future students wouldn't have to experience what we did. Living in a small town wasn't easy, especially when you're the kid whose dad shows up maybe twice a year, if you're lucky. My mom worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table while my father lived his life however he pleased. Every time he'd show up, it was the same routine: empty promises and disappearing acts. I remember sitting by the window on my birthdays, hoping he'd show up like he promised. He rarely did. When I was 12, I overheard my mom crying on the phone with her sister about how she couldn't afford my school supplies because my dad hadn't paid child support in months. That was the day I stopped expecting anything from him. My mom was my rock. She never bad-mouthed him in front of me, even though she had every right to. She'd just say that sometimes people aren't ready to be parents. She worked at the local diner during the day and cleaned offices at night. Despite everything, she managed to keep our little ranch house, making sure I always had a stable home. The court battles over child support became a regular thing in my teenage years. He'd get arrested, promise to pay, make a few payments, then disappear again. Each time he resurfaced, it was usually with a new girlfriend or wife who'd try to play peacemaker, like they could fix years of abandonment with a few kind words. When my mom got sick, it happened fast. Cancer doesn't care about unfinished business or unresolved relationships. She was gone within 6 months. I was 28 when I lost her, and my dad didn't even show up to the funeral. He sent a text message 3 days later saying he was sorry to hear about my mom and to let him know if I needed anything. I didn't respond. What was there to say? Now I live in mom's ranch house with my girlfriend and her 7-year-old daughter. We've made it our home, filled it with new memories while keeping mom's spirit alive. My girlfriend's daughter calls me Papa, which means more to me than any biological connection ever has. Then last week, I got a call from the hospital. My dad had been in a bad motorcycle accident. Despite everything, I went to see him. That's when I met his newest wife. Let's call her Karen. She's one of those people who acts like she's known you forever after 5 minutes. As soon as I walked in, Karen gushed about how glad they were to see me, claiming my father had been talking about me. I responded sarcastically, noting that was something new. My dad was lying in the bed, leg elevated and wrapped in a cast. He tried to give me that charm smile he always used when he wanted something. My dad started talking about arrangements, explaining how the doctor said he'd need help for at least 6 weeks, and their apartment was on the 3rd floor with no elevator. When I suggested looking into rehabilitation facilities, Karen jumped in with their real agenda. She announced they had been thinking about staying at my place, praising how perfect it would be with everything on 1 floor. She quickly added, they would pay rent, of course. The audacity of this woman and my father thinking they could just move into my home, into my mom's house, hit me like a slap in the face. I told them that wasn't going to work. My dad had the nerve to ask why not, questioning if I didn't trust my old man, reminding me again about their offer to pay rent. I shot back, asking how I could trust him to pay rent when he couldn't even trust him to pay mom child support for 18 years. Karen immediately got defensive, calling me extremely rude and trying to guilt-trip me about how my father was injured. I responded by pointing out how funny it was that family becomes important when they need something, questioning where this family spirit was when my mom was raising me alone, working 2 jobs, and when she was dying. My dad tried to dismiss it all, claiming it was in the past, and that he was trying. I called him out on his desperation, suggesting he ask one of Karen's 5 kids, or maybe one of his other 3 children he had with other ex-wives that he also abandoned. Karen got angry, telling me how dare I bring up the past, insisting my father had changed. I couldn't hold back anymore. I brought up how he didn't even come to my mom's funeral, just sent a text message, and now they wanted to move into her house. My dad called me unreasonable, playing the family card. I laid out exactly what family meant to me. My girlfriend's daughter calling me Papa because I show up every day, and my mom who worked herself to exhaustion to give me a good life. I told him he was just a man who occasionally remembers he has a kid when it's convenient. Karen started yelling for a nurse, claiming I was upsetting the patient. I announced I was leaving, but made it crystal clear that this house was my mom's legacy, where she raised me alone, where she died, and where I'm raising my own family now. I told them they would never live there, and they needed to figure something else out. As I was being escorted out by hospital security, I could hear Karen complaining about how ungrateful I was. My dad just lay there, silent as always, when things got tough. Walking to my car, I felt lighter than I had in years. Maybe it wasn't the most polite way to handle things, but sometimes the truth needs to be said out loud. When I got home, my girlfriend's daughter ran to greet me with a big hug, showing me the drawing she made at school. My girlfriend squeezed my hand, understanding in her eyes. Looking around at the home my mom worked so hard to keep, at the family I chose and who chose me back, I knew I'd made the right decision. Some spaces are sacred, and some people don't deserve second chances just because they share your DNA. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.